Hello and welcome to our London History Podcast, where we share our love of London, its people, places and history. It's designed for you to learn things about London that most Londoners don't even know. I am your host, Hazel Baker, qualified London tour guide and CEO and founder of londonguidedwalks.co.uk. Each episode is supported by show notes, transcripts, photos and further reading, sometimes even videos, all to be found on our website londonguidedwalks.co.uk/podcast and then select the episode that you fancy. If you enjoy what we do, then you will love our guided walks and private tours that we offer throughout the year. Joining me in the studio today is City of London tour guide Ian McDiarmid. Hello, Ian.
Hello, Hazel.
This week's episode is about the Port of London, and as that's a massive subject, we're going to be focusing on the Tudor period, which is a bit strange, isn't it, Ian? And we don't often hear about the Port of London in Tudor times.
No, it's surprising that when you read general books on London, and this applies to both the 16th century and the Middle Ages, you can often read textbooks and they hardly make any mention of the port at all, which is quite extraordinary given its absolute importance to London and its absolute importance to England as well. And I'm not quite sure why that is. Maybe the sources aren't great, but as we're about to suggest, the sources are in fact quite good for the first half of Elizabeth's reign, which is what we're going to be concentrating on. In particular, at this time, we've got the beginnings of accurate pictures of London, and in particular we have the first maps being made. I say maps, what we've got, the two main sources as it were for getting an image of London are the Agas map and something called the Civitates Orbis Terrarum map, or the Civitates map for short. And Civitates Orbis Terrarum is Latin for maps of the world. So it's an atlas. And this is an atlas that's produced in 1572 in Cologne. And within its hundreds of maps of cities from around the world, it includes one of London. And the Agas map is a large map made from wood blocks. I should say that the Civitates map is a copper plate. It's made from two copper plates and formed two leaves within the atlas. You'd open the atlas and you'd have this map of London. The Agas map is bigger. It's about 2 meters, I think, in length, and was made up of 8 wood blocks. And because wood block engraving is cruder than engraving on metal, and metal engraving is much more expensive and the plates last a lot longer. And the Agas map itself is a little bit crude. And one of the things that when you see reproductions of it, you can see the joins between the wood blocks. So it's a little bit of a crude thing. But anyway, these are our two earliest images of London. The Agas map dates somewhere probably between 1561 and 1571. One interesting feature of both of these is that they both include the spire of St. Paul's, which was a very notable landmark and which was destroyed by lightning in 1561. They both derive from an original which is largely but not completely lost, and that original must have been a tremendously expensive product. It's known as the copperplate map, and we've got 3 surviving copper plates, which is one of the reasons we know about it. And it looks as though these 2 maps that I've spoken about are derived from that. And as I say, this is hugely important because it's the first kind of accurate map of London.
Yeah, and when you say about the 3 copper plates, you mean the 3 out of the 15 that survived?
Yes, and also so 3 out of 15, and also they're very badly eroded because they obviously were used a lot for printing, and also they've been reused. So the reason they've survived is that people repurposed the plates and used them for making a painting on the other side. So this is why the 3 plates have survived. But anyway, enough has come down to show that this was an incredibly expensive thing. It might well have been produced by Hanseatic merchants in the 1550s. They might have been presenting an elaborate gift to Philip II, who was the consort of Queen Mary, lobbying for a renewal of their privileges. When we say maps, the Civitates map is the one that's closest to a map in the sense that the view is largely map-like. I say largely because it actually does your head in when you look at it, because the perspective moves around. The Agas map isn't by Agas, and it isn't a map. This is the kind of thing that historians love talking about. So Agas was a surveyor in the reign of Elizabeth, and the map was for a long time attributed to him, but it wasn't by him. And it's not really a map because it's done as a kind of view from an angle looking down at London. But nevertheless, they're both very, very accurate in terms of reproducing what was there, and therefore they're extremely interesting. And dominating both, obviously, is the River Thames. And you can see details of the Thames. And one of the things is that the London Bridge, which we'll come on to a little bit later on, I suspect, to downriver of the Thames to the east, you can see the Thames is quite well populated with large sailing ships. And then upriver from the Thames, things change because you've got small boats, not sailing ships. And one nice little detail is that, obviously deriving from the copperplate map, there's a little detail of a barge being pulled, and that is the royal barge making its way upriver.
And I'll add links to these images in the show notes for episode 95.
I should say that the names Agas map and Civitates, particularly the full Latin Civitates Orbis Terrarum map, might sound a bit off-putting, but I think a lot of people, if they see the images, they'll recognise them because they're very well known, aren't they, Hazel?
Yes, indeed. I even have one as my screensaver.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that provides no end of fascination to anybody interested in the history of London. You can look up buildings and streets, and yes, well worth having a look at. But anyway, we're focusing on the river.
So you mentioned we have two sources. If the maps are one, what's the other?
Well, the other one is a major reform of the customs that's begun under Queen Mary and then is carried on into the beginning of Elizabeth's reign. And the key figure here is William Paulet, who is the treasurer. And he's a great political survivor. So he becomes Lord Treasurer under Edward VI, is Lord Treasurer under Queen Mary, and then is Lord Treasurer again under Elizabeth until his death. And the customs are an enormous source of revenue to the crown, so they're extremely important. But there were two sort of main problems with them. One that Paulet faced. So you've got this major source of revenue, but the problem is that there's an awful lot of evasion going on, and the evasion takes two forms. One is smuggling, when you don't pay any duties at all, and the other problem is corruption amongst the officials administering the customs. The second problem is that the way the customs work is that they are mainly an ad valorem tax. So an ad valorem tax is a bit like VAT today. It's a percentage of the value of them. And they introduce a book of rates. The first book of rates is introduced in 1509, and it's not really updated. They do issue a new one in 1545, but they don't really they don't really update the prices. And the way customs work, the two main sources of custom revenue were tonnage and poundage. So tonnage is a tax on liquids coming in tons or barrels, most importantly wine, but also oil. And then poundage is a tax on what we would call dry goods in whatever containers. Nails, for example, were imported in tons, but you pay an ad valorem tax on the value of the nails. And the ad valorem tax was 1 shilling in the pound. Before decimalisation, there were 20 shillings in the pound, so a tax of 1 shilling in the pound would be put into modern parlance as a 5% tax. And the problem with that is if you're not updating the books frequently, and they're not, because it's a huge task, inflation quickly erodes the value of the tax. And when Paulet comes, he issues a new book of rates in 1559. And when he does it, the value of the goods pretty much doubles, in all the cases, almost doubles. And the other thing he does is he greatly extends the list of things that the customs cover, the list of products. And finally, in terms of his reforms leading from these reforms, we have a great picture of how London looked and operated, because one of the things that he does is he reforms the system of legal keys. A legal key is where you can legitimately load and unload cargoes, and your goods can then be inspected by customs. Now, before Paulet's time, there were, in theory, 3 legal keys. They were at Queenhithe, Dowgate, and Billingsgate. But in effect, they used a lot more, and people were unloading and loading goods all the way up and down the river. And when I say all the way up and down the river, it includes the South Bank, which was not included in Paulet's system, so that you could, for example, they were unloading goods at Deptford, Woolwich, Greenwich, all along the North Bank, and then all along in the city itself, including Southwark. And they just can't keep an eye on this. And so what he does is he says, right, from now on, there's going to be a new system of legal keys, and there's 24 of them, and they run on the North Bank of the Thames, running from the east to the west. They begin at the Tower. There's 24 of them, and they go as far as Queenhithe. Now, Queenhithe might not mean an awful lot to people listening to this. So if you walk along modern day London on the North Bank and you walk just beyond London Bridge heading westwards, you will come to what looks like a harbour, which is Queenhithe. And this is the footprint of the medieval wharf, which is established in the reign of Henry I. And the reason it looks like a harbour is that people were able to build either side of it, so that basically the embankment of the Thames was pushed out into the river on either side, and you've got the footprint of that, and it looks like a harbour. And these legal keys go as far as that. And the incredible thing about them is that the short frontage of these legal keys, so it was 2,000 feet, and before doing this podcast, I did a little check, and that's around 610 metres. It's very, very short distance. And another interesting thing is that they go up to, but they don't include Queenhithe, which shows that Queenhithe is completely redundant. So in Henry I's reign, when Queenhithe gets going, it is the main wharf in the Port of London. But by this time, it's dead. And what we can do is we can follow these legal keys up. So you begin just beyond the Tower and you walk westward, so you're walking up the river. And the first one you would come to, the most easterly of these, was Galley Quay, which was, as the name might suggest, was originally for loading logs, but long lost that function. And then you come to 2 slightly unusual ones. You come to Old Wool Quay and Custom House Quay. And I say these are unusual because one of the things that Paulet does is he buys these wharves for the Crown. All the rest of the wharves along the river are leasehold and they're privately held, but these 2 are bought by the Crown. And we don't quite know what he was up to, but it looks as though this was the beginnings of some grander plan for Crown control, perhaps of the riverbank, which never really got anywhere. And you might have thought, well, if these quays are owned by the Crown, they're going to be better looked after than the other quays. But we've got lots of contemporaries complaining about them both. Old Wool Quay was one of the quays that was made of wood. A lot of them are still wooden, and there are lots of complaints about it being decayed at this time. And then Custom House itself, Paulet spends a lot of money on. He builds Custom House. I was saying earlier how great these maps are as sources for how things look, but unfortunately the various visual sources for the Custom House vary, so we don't actually know what the Customs House precisely looked like, but it was a brick-built building. And there the complaints about the quay, which is stone-fronted this time, but people complain about it being too far away from the river. So at low tide, it's very difficult for small boats to actually use it because the water's not deep enough. Anyway, you progress on that side of the river and you come up to London Bridge, where you come to the 20th quay, which is Fresh Wharf. And Fresh Wharf is for where there was a market for fish and eels. So this is one of the quays where fish and eels are unloaded. And then finally, once you get beyond the bridge, there are 4 more. And within these 4, one of them is the Steelyard, which is the base of the Hanseatic merchants, the German merchants in London. And the last one is 3 Cranes Wharf. And this is obviously an old name, but if you look closely on the 2 maps mentioned earlier, you can see little details of a crane.
And you still can go to the Three Cranes pub.
And the big dividing line here on the river, which we've alluded to briefly already, is the bridge. And you were telling me, Hazel, that there is good evidence that the bridge was still operable, i.e. still being open fairly late in the 15th century.
Yes. Many people don't realise that there was a drawbridge on the medieval London Bridge, and this was our only bridge in London that crossed the River Thames. The drawbridge was raised to allow ships that were too large to go underneath its arches, and it was also quite handy when you had hostile mobs coming towards the bridge intending to cross it and therefore entering the city. So you could pull the drawbridge up and protect your city that way. It was in 1497 where the drawbridge on London Bridge was deemed too poor condition and needed to be secured in place. However, in 1500, Henry VII decided he wanted his royal bark to be able to sail upstream, and so carpenters were paid to work throughout the night, so the drawbridge would open up for him.
So that would indicate that the big ships have the possibility of going upriver. However, I would guess that perhaps the bother of opening it was a discouragement to them. This probably explains why there are only 4 quays further up the river from the 4 legal quays, that is, further up from the bridge itself.
Yeah, it was in 1577 that the stone drawbridge tower was so dilapidated that they demolished it. And that's when the heads of the traitors that were on the tower were then moved from the city side of the bridge to the Southwark side.
Oh, okay. And so when that happens, the bridge can no longer open?
Yeah, well, I'm kind of guessing that the drawbridge had all of its mechanisms for lifting mechanisms in the tower as well.
Okay. Talking about this sort of raises the question, what actually happened upriver then? And I was saying that the legal quays run for 2,000 feet up from the tower. The rest of the Thames side within the City of London was populated by wharves, but those wharves were used for inland trade. So they're basically for products going up and down the River Thames itself, but not to do with overseas trade.
Yeah, that would make sense then, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and one other final thing to say about the river in its entire length. We're talking about trade, but on those maps are sort of small boats going, and we should mention that the river is an extremely busy place for traffic, lots of people being ferried across the river. And one of the things you can see on the maps are stairways going down to the river itself. And a lot of these stairways survive, and therefore people to gain access to the boats to taxi them across to the other side.
It might be worth looking at what the trades in Tudor London consisted of, and also the role that it played in England's economy as a whole.
Well, one of the extraordinary things about this period is how London completely dominates England's trade. So in the Middle Ages, the outports, which are the ports which aren't London, had been of some significance, but they are completely eclipsed by this period. And in Elizabeth's reign, probably London accounts for about 90% of exports by volume, so absolutely huge. And there are several reasons for this dominance. One is that London obviously is the largest town. It dominates the national economy. As a result of this, it accounts for about 70% of wine imports. Talking of the wine imports, you've got a lot of aristocrats, nobles, and you've got the court spending a considerable amount of time in London, so they're obviously one source for the consumption of luxury goods. London has much larger financial capacity than any other place in England. It's got depths of market, and it's got fairly sophisticated corporate structures. It's got the larger dock houses and warehouses. It's got the sailors and captains. But the crucial element of London's dominance is all to do with cloth. And it's all to do with English broadcloth, which is by this date the far most important export. And big picture here is that at the end of the 14th century, the English begin producing broadcloth at scale and begin to export it. And prior to this date, England had largely exported raw wool. It's not just broadcloth. They also export other cloths, and in particular kerseys, which are a lightweight, fairly coarse woolen cloth. But the main thing is broadcloth. And broadcloth, if people aren't familiar with it, if you think of 18th and 19th century uniforms in a museum, whether they're naval or military, that is broadcloth. And if you picture that, you'll get immediately the selling points of broadcloth, because it's it's quite a heavy cloth, but it's very, very hard wearing and is weather resistant. And what happens with it is that it's woven into cloth, but it is then finished, it's fulled by being milled with heavy wooden hammers in soapy water, and then it's allowed to shrink. And what this does is it brings the yarns in all very, very close together, creating this rather heavy cloth, and you can't see the weave in broadcloth. It's got a kind of I think they use the phrase a blind surface to it, or a blind face to the cloth, so you can't see the weaves in it. And there was this market takes off. It's just enormous, and the main source of demand for exports of broadcloth are Central Europe. So it's going into places like Germany, modern Poland, and these areas of demand are fed by areas around the Rhine Delta. But what's crucial is that in the 15th century, the merchant adventurers who have a monopoly on the export of this cloth, so they're like a guild, but a guild that has is dealing with an overseas trade rather than with a domestic economic function. They settle their mart, i.e. where they want to sell their cloth, at Antwerp. And then the other extraordinary thing about the history of broadcloth is that it leads to this very brief period when Antwerp absolutely becomes the largest commercial centre in the north of Europe. So before Antwerp's brief rise to glory, Bruges had been the main centre, but the people running Bruges had been a bit hostile to English broadcloth. Basically, they didn't want competition to their own domestic market. But Antwerp was accommodating. And the English mart for broadcloth gets established there. And on the back of that, Antwerp then attracts in a whole load of other things as well. And one of the things that Antwerp is doing is it's becoming a centre for most of the imports that go the other way into London. But it also becomes a big commercial centre for other parts of Europe as well. And England, it's odd, the English economy, in the sense that it's dominated by the production of broadcloth, but it's not exclusively that. So England's also, as I mentioned, exporting kerseys, it's exporting wool, and then it's exporting a limited range of raw materials, things like tin in particular, but also things like leather. But essentially, England's exports absolutely dominated by broadcloth. It's a kind of one product economy. And then on the other side, it's importing a huge range of goods. And these come largely, they're not exclusively, from Antwerp. And I was saying that Antwerp's position as a great financial centre is brief. So it's from roughly from the late 15th to the late 16th centuries. And what happens is that the English relations with Spain go downhill as a result of the Reformation, but also the Dutch revolt. And particularly they go downhill when the English start intervening on the Dutch side in the Dutch revolt. And then Antwerp itself becomes a victim of the Dutch revolt because the Dutch shut off the River Scheldt on which Antwerp stands, and that is the absolute end of Antwerp. So it reaches its apogee in the 1550s and then goes into decline, but it's still of enormous importance, huge importance at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign.
And London imported quite a bit of wine, didn't we?
We imported lots of things. So but wine, yes, wine was the most important of the imports. And I was saying what a great source Paulet's reforms are. One product of his reforms is the production of the Queen's books, which are later known as the Port books. And these are produced from 1565 onwards. And they're basically accounts of the customs. So they list the ship's name, the tonnage of the ship, the master's or captain's name, the port of origin of the ship, and the port from which it sailed, and then it lists what they're carrying. And these are really an unparalleled source. I don't think any other country has anything like them. Unfortunately, they're not complete for most of it, but for 2 years, they are complete. And for one of the years, 1567 to 68, the port book has been edited by the London Record Society, and it was edited by Brian Dietz in 1972. And this is it's a brilliant book. It's so interesting, but also Dietz's edits are fantastic as well. So he goes through a lot of the data and puts them into appendices. And basically, this is a record of all the native trade. So it doesn't include alien merchants, but native trade includes the Hanseatic merchants, the Germans, who were privileged merchants, and one of their great privileges was that they paid the same customs rates as English merchants. One might add that they're incredibly important, but they're also widely hated. And you were saying that wine was the most important. Dietz analyzes the value of all the imports. You can see this appendix. He's got the total value, and the largest coming in was wine, which accounts for 10.5% of the total value of the imports. And the next largest one I think is interesting is linen, which comes in a very close second at 9.5%. So huge demand for linen, and linen is produced primarily in Flanders, but also comes from northern France. We at London Guided Walks have a particular interest in eels. If anybody doesn't know why I'm saying that, there's an earlier, which I thought very interesting podcast on the eel boats in the Thames, about which I knew absolutely nothing before you made the podcast. Very interesting subject.
It is so interesting. So anybody who hasn't listened to it, it is episode 83, Dutch Eels in Medieval London. And that's when I talk with the lovely John Wyatt Greenley about the Dutch trade of eels in medieval London.
Yeah, so anyway, I was just about to say that the total value of imports in the book for this year, 1567 to 68, was the total value was 643,000. And of that total, eels, both fresh and salted, accounted for £1,500 worth. And they would have been unloaded at Fresh Wharf, which is the one that we were talking earlier on. And to give a kind of picture of how fascinating this book is, Dietz, in one of his appendices, he provides a list of all the goods that were enumerated in these lists, and he does this alphabetically. And some of them go on for miles and miles, but I thought I'd just do the letter E, and I've chosen the letter E simply because it's one of the shortest, but also it happens to cover the word eel. And under E, the listing goes as follows. It goes ear picks, éclos cloth, eels, various kinds, and epithyme, which is used in medicine. I think the modern name for it is dodder. And then the final one is ermine. Now, a couple of those need a little bit of elaboration. Éclos cloth, which is written with a double E, so I think they might have well said éclos cloth. Éclos was one of the main production sites for linen in Flanders. And then the eels are interesting because they're divided up. They're divided up into dole, pimper, shaft, and stub eels. And my understanding is that nobody has any idea what these words mean.
Oh, well, I might be able to help you there, actually.
Really?
Yes, because I have a brand new book and I'm very excited because I think this is its time to shine. It's called Sources of London English, Medieval Thames Vocabulary, and it's written by Laura Wright. And in here, she has excursions of the name of fish brought to London by boat between about 1270 and 1500. And guess what's included?
Eels?
How did you guess? Yeah, so first one that she comes up with is conger, the large marine eel now occasionally found in the Thames. And I didn't know that. Conger eels in the Thames. Then Kemp eel, which you didn't mention, but that's apparently a red eel. And then a pimpernel, which is a type of small eel. But then, your shaft eel comes in. And is a type of middle-sized eel. Long, slender rod and arrow shaft. There you go. And she has got some Latin, which I won't embarrass myself with doing. But basically, the English translation is, when they arrive at the city aforesaid, they bring the various sorts of their eels. From the largest are called stubble eels. Some from the middling are called shaft eels.
Oh, well done.
I know, I'm rather pleased with myself out there. So I think we're starting to get to know eels rather well in London.
Yeah, well, very good.
Well, there you go. My new book.
The other thing about these lists, apart from listing the goods, obviously the ships are listed, and they're very interested. And most of them, and as I mentioned earlier, they mentioned the tonnage, and most of them are about 40 or 60 tons. And to give an impression, we can actually give quite a good impression of what that looked like, because on the south bank of the Thames today there is a reproduction of the Golden Hind. And from memory, I think this reproduction ship was made in the 1970s, and they've been restoring it lately. That had a capacity that had a tonnage of 150, so 150 for the Golden Hind and about 40 or 60 for these other things. And I think inevitably both you and I walk quite frequently by the Golden Hind, and I'm a bit nervous about saying this in case people who are experts in naval architecture come back at me for my generalities and lack of knowledge. But whenever I walk past it, I always have the thought of, I really wouldn't like to cross the channel in that boat. And yet, of course, it's famous because Drake sailed around the globe in it. But so anyway, most of these ships are quite small. But one of them actually stood out in this list is the Barbara of Venice. So most of the ships are coming from Antwerp. So this is an unusual one, sailing all the way from Venice, and that was 400 tons. So most of them are 40 or 60. This ship from Venice, 400 tons, and then it lists the master as Nicholas de Corsolo, and the main cargo on that one was butts of wine.
This is somewhat of a practical question then, Ian. How were the customs actually raised?
Well, you've got to have a fairly, in theory, effective system for collecting this, because people have got quite big incentives to try and avoid it. And Customs House, they employed men known as waiters or servers who went aboard a ship as soon as it dropped anchor. And they required from the master a certificate specifying the ship's name, its details, and a bill of lading for the whole cargo. And from these, the waiters could have a quick look at the cargo, make sure that it sort of tallied with what the ship's captain was saying. And then that was passed on to the officials at Customs House. And then the officials who actually collected the revenue took over, and there were always two waiters and two collectors actually involved in collecting the customs. And the reason you have two officials is that it makes collusion that much harder. And so you've got sort of two books to be. Well, in fact, you've got a total of 4 books. You've got the two collectors' books, you've got the two waiters' books, and then these are all looked at by the man in charge, the controller, who then is responsible for handing over the money and also accounts to the exchequer. There were, within this system, there are two big worries from the authorities. One is smuggling, and the other is corrupt officials siphoning off the money. And it's very difficult to really get a picture of how much revenue was lost, because by the nature it won't appear in the records. However, we can make some general comments. First of all, contemporaries were always complaining about fraud and negligence from the customs officials. Secondly, the officials, and we're talking about royal officials in London, were not paid very much. And then finally, there are lots of references to blind keys, by which people mean that the Customs House really didn't have a great deal of visibility on the keys that were furthest away from it. On the positive side, however, as we've already mentioned, the actual distance of the legal keys is quite limited, 2,000 feet. And then historians are rather reduced to generalities on this. And one of the comments which I like, I'm not sure how helpful it is, but is to point out that in the big sweep of historical things, 5% rate of customs is not that big. When we think about smuggling, we think about the 18th century when it's a huge industry. And then the customs on certain goods were 35%. So it might not have been worth it. Also, London merchants had their reputations to think about. These are men whose credit and standing in the community rely on their probity. They also need to do accounts just to run their businesses, and they need to keep on the good side of government as well. And finally, we can point to this system of having two officials probably made it harder to collude. And the examples that we have of fraud come from officials who have been caught for fraud, but they've been caught for fraud after doing the books. Now, this might be significant because it might suggest that before they actually draw up their books, their descriptions of the goods, it's very difficult for them to indulge in fraud. Anyway, one case is of a man named William Byrd, who is caught in the 1560s, and he took his cut after compiling his accounts, and then he tried to make his handwriting look illegible, and he actually tried to erase some of the accounts to make them illegible, but he was caught. And as I say, for smuggling, well, who knows? But I guess the assumption is it's probably easier to do it out of London than in London. And one interesting thing is that we have this elaborate system, which I've described. In the outports, they didn't bother with this. They just farmed the customs, which means that somebody leased the customs. They paid the Crown a sum up front, and then they are responsible for collecting the customs. And obviously that kind of privatizes the collection of a revenue, and it gives an incentive to the person with the farm to look after, try and make sure that smuggling and fraud are limited, and it's on their own shoulders. So I think a lot of people, when they read about tax farming, which becomes very widespread in the 17th century, they think, what a curious primitive system. But actually it made quite a lot of sense for the outports at least.
I think it might be worth discussing who was actually doing the trading. I mean, was it companies, guilds, individuals, or was it a mix?
Yeah, well, I think it's a mix. So at the heart of it is individuals, but they are largely operating within some kind of corporate structure. So that is to say that it's individuals putting up the capital at risk, taking all the risks, but they belong to wider structures which provided them with important means of support. And the most important of these organisations was the merchant adventurers. So like a guild, it was monopoly, but like the guilds, this structure conferred numerous benefits, particularly on its members, but also on other people. And the merchant adventurers, one of their main things is that if all the merchants are united together in one company, they speak with one voice. And the merchant adventurers are able to act on behalf of its members and negotiate these privileges with Antwerp, which is the most important one. But they could also lobby the English crown, which was important. They regulated their members' behaviour. So if merchants were a bit naughty in a foreign port, like getting drunk or something like that, the merchant adventurers would take action on that, and they could ultimately expel members. And the company structure itself is useful for the crown because it means that the English crown has a means of enforcement, of controlling its merchants abroad. And essentially this is what's known as a regulated company, and others are created on its model. So there's also the Spanish company, and the most important of these was the Eastland Company, which dealt with the Baltic. And regulated company, as the title implies, the company is like a guild. It's providing a structure, but it's the merchants individually who are, as I said, putting their capital at risk and undertaking voyages and undertaking business. Now, it's also at this period that you get the beginnings of joint stock companies. And in a joint stock company, merchants invest, they pool their capital, and they're also granted limited liability. So if the venture fails, the creditors can't go after all of their wealth. They can only go after that bit which was invested in this joint stock company. And these are seen as very important from what's going to happen later. But actually in this period, they aren't that significant. So the examples of them, the Russia Company, which is formed in 1555, and the Levant Company in 1581, and they are, as the two geographical destinations imply, they're places that are a long way away. They're too risky, really, for one or two merchants, where there are limited diplomatic ties. But both of these companies soon abandoned the joint stock company, and basically they become like the regulated companies that we've been talking about. And then finally, at the very end of Elizabeth's reign, 1600, you get the formation of the East India Company, which will become very important, but only in the course of the 17th century. And then, in addition to being part of perhaps the merchant adventurers or possibly one of these other regulated companies, the merchants would uniformly belong to guilds. Now, the guilds might by this stage have been involved in the trade for which they were originally founded, but they could just as well not have been. And again, these provide advantages to merchants. They're useful as a means of networking, securing a powerful ally to have a corporate body acting for you in case of disputes. They're a mechanism for lobbying. And the indications from the lay subsidy in 1541, a tax imposed by the crown, suggests that the most prosperous companies at this time were the drapers, goldsmiths, merchant tailors, fishmongers, and vintners.
Makes sense, doesn't it? I don't want anyone accusing of us of being remiss, Ian. So when talking about London, obviously the City of London is important. But what about the happenings downriver?
Well, what's happening is that in a way, London is beginning its kind of expansion. And the most important thing, which is related to London as a port, but not really related to commerce, is Henry VIII and the establishment of the dockyards, the royal dockyards at Woolwich and Deptford. And this has given increased momentum towards the end of Henry's reign in 1545, when the combined forces of Spain and France attempt to invade England, and they cause quite a lot of damage to the Isle of Wight and the south coast, and this sort of gives the further impetus for the need to build ships. And at this period, Deptford is the largest shipyard in England, and part of the reason for the development of them on the Thames is it's a lot safer than the south coast, where the largest dockyards have been before that. Also, you're getting in the 16th century as a whole, not just Elizabeth's reign, but you're getting an increasing growth of traffic on the river. And at the beginning of the 16th century, 1514, I think, Trinity House is formed. And Trinity House is responsible for pilotage on the Thames. And by the mid-16th century, so getting towards Elizabeth's reign, they've also taken over responsibility for things like the provision of beacons, buoys, the supply of ballast, conservation of the river, which basically essentially making it sure that it's still navigable. And you also get the authorization of the Thames watermen. So in 1555, there's an act which says that 8 watermen are to supervise the Thames all the way from Greenwich to Windsor to prevent accidents and to ensure minimum dimensions for boats used for carrying passengers on the Thames. So the watermen are the taxi men of the day. So outside the confines of the city, you're getting increased activity on the river, and with these dockyards, you're getting the gradual expansion of London and all the trades that go with shipbuilding as well. So in itself, an important development.
Fantastic. Who knew the Port of London in Tudor London would be so interesting? Thank you, Ian.
My pleasure.
Don't forget, we are available for private tours as well as our scheduled guided walk, so just check that out on our website, which also has periods of London history, including Tudor London history. And you can check that out at londonguidedwalks.co.uk/history/Tudor and see all the related content for then. And that also gives you the opportunity to sign up to be the first to know when my brand new book, Royal Tudor Palaces of London, is published. That's all for now. See you next time.